This building in downtown Austin became the headquarters of Edward Clark's all-powerful law firm. Barr McClellan was recruited as a young lawyer in 1966, 3 years after the assassination, unaware of the dark secrets hidden within. Soon after joining, in an after-hours conversation with John Coates, one of the firm's attorneys, Barr was made privy to an astonishing piece of information.
Coates and I started talking, and in the course of it, John told me, if the truth be told, Clark arranged the assassination of Kennedy. It was a kind of statement that you can't easily forget, even though I personally chose not to believe it at the time. It stuck with me. Attorneys know they're acting behind a privilege. They can say things to each other. And this talk would go on at after-hours drinks, Christmas parties, just traveling on the road. And it was like Johnson had to get Kennedy out of the way. I worked closely with Don Thomas, and Thomas was the business attorney to the president and was the second man in the law firm. Thomas and I did a number of cases together, and we traveled the state because he did not fly. We'd been to Dallas one day shortly after I became partner, and it was driving back, and just out of the blue, it seems now, looking back, that Thomas said, "I am the only living man who knows what happened in Box 13. Now, we know what that meant. That was the stolen 1948 election. I didn't say anything. Sometimes it's best just to listen. And then he looked away and added, but Clark took care of things in Dallas. At that point, what I'd been hearing in the law firm, what John Coates had first told me, I knew was true, because this came from a man that was Johnson's business attorney, one of Johnson's most trusted confidants, a man who worked very closely with Johnson during his maturing years, his growing up years, so to speak, and as president. And when I heard that, there was no question that Clark had been behind the assassination, and he'd done it for Johnson. I know beyond a reasonable doubt that Johnson murdered Kennedy. He acted through Clark. He saw that it was done, and he did it out of a corruption of power that is unequaled in our history.
After becoming a senator in 1948, Johnson developed an unrivaled power base in Washington, using his forceful personality, political skills, and corruption. He established himself as one of the most influential men in the nation, but as vice president to Kennedy, he lost much of that authority. By 1961, his past was catching up with him. In Texas, Henry Marshall, a local agricultural official, had begun investigating one of Johnson's illegal sources of funding. Working out of these offices in Bryan, Texas, Marshall had become aware of Billy Solesti's misappropriation of federal cotton allotment funds. Attempts to buy off Marshall had failed, and his investigations were beginning to threaten the vice president himself.
Billy Solestes became worried, Lyndon Johnson became worried, and some of them got together and decided, what are we going to do with Henry Marshall? So on one particular day, according to Billy Solestes, Cliff Carter, an aide to Lyndon Johnson, the vice president of the United States, and Malcolm Wallace got together. And finally, Lyndon made the statement, get rid of him.
On June the 3rd, 1961, Henry Marshall failed to return home. An extensive search was made of the family farm near Franklin, Texas. His only son, Don, was 11 years old at the time and remembers that day well.
My uncle found him on the second attempt when he went out to the place. He was in a very remote location, probably about 3/4 of a mile off the road. My mother had this stone placed here in order to mark the spot. The truck had blood around the sides of it. The side on the passenger side had a dent in the fender behind the passenger door, and that's apparently where my father's head was knocked into the side of the truck, and he had his eye damaged at that point. There were a number of yopon bushes that had been broken, and the gun was laying beside the body, and pretty much nothing else could be seen except signs of a struggle.
Local officials immediately ruled it a suicide, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
He had been shot 5 times with a bolt-action rifle. He had enough carbon monoxide in his lungs to cause him to pass out at the time he died. There was no effort made to collect any evidence or preserve the crime scene. They had pretty much determined in their minds that this was going to be a suicide. When Billy Saul Estes testified before the grand jury in Franklin, he implicated Cliff Carter and Malcolm Wallace as the people that were most involved in my father's murder. Wallace being the trigger man and Cliff Carter being the one who arranged for the murder. I'm firmly convinced that Malcolm Wallace was the killer of my father. Who that would have aided, probably political power behind everything. Johnson would have been aided more than anyone else.
The grand jury concluded Henry Marshall in 1961 was murdered, which means in simple language that the grand jury believed Billy Saul Estes when he told them that Lyndon Johnson had ordered Malcolm Wallace to kill Henry Marshall.
But Johnson's dark dealings were not confined to Texas. In late summer 1963, one of his long-term partners in crime was about to be exposed for corruption by a Senate investigation.
Bobby Baker was the secretary to the Senate majority. Basically, he was the secretary for the Senate, and he was one of Lyndon Johnson's closest associates. And everything that Lyndon Johnson wanted to perpetrate, he had Bobby's help. Essentially, if somebody wanted to get a military contract and they wanted influence of Lyndon Johnson to help them, they had to pay off Bobby Baker, who would then pay off Lyndon Johnson. It's the world of bribes. Bobby Baker was involved in a call girl service. He was involved in real estate scams. He was involved in dealings with organized crime. He was in dealings with oil men, particularly Clint Murchison, an oil millionaire from Texas. So as a result of all this, Bobby Baker was in big trouble. And with a little bit of inspiration on the part of the Kennedys that they could get Bobby Baker to talk, Lyndon was all done. Lyndon Baines Johnson, if Robert Kennedy had his way, would not only not be on the 1964 ticket as the vice presidential candidate, but he would go to jail for the corruption that he was involved with.
Although Johnson faced political extinction at the hands of the Kennedys, he had powerful allies with their own agendas that threatened the president, as researcher Gregory Burnham explains.
People would think that he had no enemies. He was so popular. He smiled. He appeared happy. Everyone loved him worldwide. But what people don't seem to understand is behind the scenes, he was making changes, and he was making them decisively, and he was taking some very, very daring steps. He was committed to pull out of Vietnam. By October, he had signed a document, an SAM 263, to that effect. 1,000 troops home by Christmas, and all personnel out of Vietnam by 1965. But that wasn't very good for the military-industrial complex. Is abolishing the Central Intelligence Agency, pulling their teeth, holding them to task, back to why they were originally created by Truman. Their original mandate by law is only to coordinate intelligence, not to create the Bay of Pigs. NSAM 55 told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the CIA no longer can do that, and any military operation has to come directly from them to the president, period. That kind of a document really causes problems.
Make a comment about something which a lot of folks haven't heard too much about. Do you know about this article by Arthur Kroc? Younger people are saying, who's Arthur Kroc? Arthur Kroc was the single most respected journalist in America in the 1960s. He wrote on the editorial page of the New York Times. He was very close to the Kennedys. In fact, Joseph Kennedy, John Kennedy's father's first book was ghostwritten by Arthur Kroc. And young John Kennedy, when he was a young man, and worked on his thesis, Why England Slept, he wrote it in Arthur Kroc's Georgetown Library with the help of Arthur Kroc, and then Arthur Kroc had it turned into a book and got him a literary agent. That's how close he was. John Kennedy, when he wanted to speak to the American people, talked to Arthur Kroc, and Arthur Kroc would publish material. This is October 3rd, 1963, editorial page of the New York Times. Arthur Kroc's column called The Intra-Administration War in Vietnam. And Arthur Kroc is saying John Kennedy has declared war on the Central Intelligence Agency, and John Kennedy wants the American people to know there are some very serious problems. And then he goes on to say, twice, according to a high United States source, twice the CIA flatly refused to carry out instructions from Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, that was Kennedy's ambassador to Vietnam. And in one instance, frustrated a plan of action Mr. Lodge brought from Washington, from John Kennedy, because the agency disagreed with it. You like that? The CIA disagreed with it. They don't do what the president says. Then it goes on. Listen to this. The CIA's growth was likened to a malignancy, which the very high official was not sure even the White House could control any longer. And listen to this. If the United States ever experiences an attempt at a coup to overthrow the government, it will come from the CIA. That's John Kennedy talking to the American people in October. The next month they blew his head off. And there's the Warren Commission, and they don't ask Arthur Kroc, where'd you get this information that John Kennedy was talking, or someone on his behalf was talking, to you about the CIA being possibly involved in a coup. If there was a coup, it would come from the CIA.
There is now considerable evidence of Oswald's links with agents from the CIA and the FBI in the months before the assassination. In August 1963 in Dallas, the CIA operative Antonio Veciana met with his case officer Maurice Bishop. Bishop was the CIA coordinator of the most violent anti-Castro exile group. And in Dallas, he also met with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Actually, Harvey Oswald in Dallas in a meeting of 10 or 15 minutes with Mr. Maurice Bishop in Dallas in that time.
And you feel certain that Oswald was working with or associated with American intelligence?
Well, at least he was associated with Maurice Bishop. And if Maurice Bishop was intelligence, he was working for the intelligence service in the United States, I don't doubt that he was working with him.
The Select Committee on Assassinations will at this time come to order.
The most damaging sealed documents of the House Select Committee on Assassinations accuse high-ranking officials of the Central Intelligence Agency of lying to the people of the United States about Lee Harvey Oswald. House investigators believe this man, David Atlee Phillips, met with Oswald 2 months before the assassination. Phillips was the CIA's chief of Western Hemisphere operations and was in charge, among other things, of plots against Fidel Castro. According to the secret reports, Antonio Veciana, a leader of anti-Castro Cubans directed by the CIA, saw Oswald talking to a senior CIA agent he knew by the cover name Maurice Bishop. Veciana provided enough information for House investigators to compile this sketch of the agent who met Oswald. Could it have been Phillips? Investigators believe it was. Phillips denied under oath that he knew Oswald, but House investigators did not believe him and wanted him charged with perjury. The government declined to prosecute, leaving investigators furious. The director of the CIA in 1963 was John McCone. He caused a sensation among committee staffers when he admitted there was an agent using the cover name Bishop. But a secret memo reveals he was allowed to reverse his testimony. A CIA lawyer wrote the committee. I should inform you that he had been in error. In summary, Mr. McCone withdraws his statements on this point. The man who fingered Maurice Bishop, Antonio Veciana, was shot in the head soon after testifying, but survived. Frightened, he will no longer talk about the case, but we caught up with him in Florida.
They wounded me in the head.
He's trying to kill me.
You know why? Why would anyone?
I don't know. Perhaps the FBI knows. The FBI knows.
Did they tell you?
No. Ask him. Ask them.
David Adley Phillips died of cancer in 1988. Investigators believe Phillips was angry at JFK for botching the Cuban Bay of Pigs operation.
Did you kill the president?
The second explosive revelation in the sealed documents also links the CIA directly to Oswald. While living in Dallas, Oswald was befriended by Russian-born George de Mohrenschildt. Investigators determined he was a contract agent for the CIA in Central America and the Caribbean. In 1977, moments before he was to be interviewed by House investigators, de Mohrenschildt blew his brains out with a 20-gauge shotgun. House investigators believe he was a crucial link between the CIA and Lee Harvey Oswald. There is no question that the sealed JFK files are extremely embarrassing for the CIA. House investigators have told Inside Edition that the agency did not fully cooperate in their investigation and that the CIA had final say in the report that the House Assassinations Committee made public. Thus, the public report makes no mention of the CIA's links with Lee Harvey Oswald. But the secret documents are another story.
One interesting sidelight, the movie JFK was partially based on Jim Garrison's investigation in New Orleans. Well, House investigators uncovered evidence that the CIA planted 9 agents inside the Garrison investigation to feed him false information and to report back to Langley on what Garrison was finding out.
What do you think about George de Mohrenschildt? Is there some accurate connection with the intelligence community?
Oh, yeah. George de Mohrenschildt was a spy for a lot of different people over the years. He was a quite remarkable man. They picked him up for what they thought was attempting to assassinate Marshal Tito. He went into Guatemala. He went into the impenetrable jungles of Guatemala. He and his wife, he said, and they emerged on the very day that the Bay of Pigs troops left Guatemala City. He arrived in Guatemala City. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He was the baby.
He must have known E. Howard Hunt, certainly, in those days.
Well, I presume he probably did, but in any event, he was the babysitter for Lee Harvey Oswald for the CIA. And he was about to be called as a witness before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and he died the day before he was supposed to call. I went down there for the coroner's inquest. It was quite interesting, because the district attorney... What happened was this. De Mohrenschildt was staying at a home where his daughter lived. His daughter was staying with a very wealthy woman in Florida. And this woman, it's kind of like a Columbo movie, and this is before the days when people had videotape recorders. She went out, this woman, to play a bridge tournament. But she wanted to watch, she wanted to have a record made of some soap opera. So she said to her domestic worker, here's an audio tape recorder, just put it on and record the sound of this television soap opera. And so the tape recorder was playing, and then you hear you hear the bullet, the shotgun explode, the shot that killed George de Mohrenschildt. They claimed he committed suicide. But if you listen to the tape, you hear this. You hear a little noise, and you hear silence, and then you hear beep, 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 a little more noise, and then you hear the shot. The beep, 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 beep was a security system on medium mode. One mode is if it's on fully armed, if anyone opens a door or window, a siren goes off and the police are notified. On another mode, it's off entirely. But on the medium mode, it goes beep, 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 beep to show that someone has opened the door and come into the house. Just before de Mohrenschildt was shot, that's what happened. And I talked to the district attorney when I listened to that tape. I was down there just before the coroner's inquest, and I said, does that sound like someone came in the house? He said, we're not going to go into that. And I said, why? I said, do you understand why this is bigger than all of us? We have to do what we have to do. I said, I don't understand that. He said, well, listen, you know, you can't speak at the coroner's inquest. You're just going to be a spectator. I said, I know that. And so he played the tape and told the coroner's jury, a cross-section of the folks in the area, that this was a suicide, etc. And this woman on the coroner's jury said, that beep, 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 that sounds like my security system. That means somebody apparently went into the house. He said, we're not going into that. And so they ruled that it was the suicide, and that was the end of that. But I think there's some very serious questions as to whether he was murdered.
It is now clear that in some instances the agency lied about the 201 file, about its contents, did not give the House Select Committee access to parts of the file that they knew existed and wanted to see.
The information it contains not only confirms the government's very early interest in Oswald's activities, but discloses a startling revelation. Oswald was directly involved in sensitive intelligence operations for the CIA and probably for the FBI as well.